The room smelled like cigarette smoke and ambition. Somewhere above the city, a taxi was moving through the wet streets of Manhattan, carrying a guitar case and a man who hadn't slept in 36 hours. The year was 1966. The season was late autumn, and the world of popular music was quietly tearing itself apart at the seams, though almost nobody had noticed yet. Jimi Hendrix was not supposed to be in New York that night. He had been booked for a session downtown, something routine, something that would pay the rent and nothing more. But the session had fallen through, the way sessions always fell through when you were young and unknown, and the only things you owned were the clothes on your back and a second-hand Stratocaster that had seen more cities than most men twice your age. So instead of a studio, he ended up at a friend's apartment in Harlem, and instead of the rent money, what he got was something he hadn't been looking for at all. He got a conversation, but the conversation didn't start the way conversations usually start. It didn't start with words at all. There was already music playing when he walked in. Not from a record, not from a radio. Someone was sitting at a small upright piano in the corner, and the sound coming from it was unlike anything Jimi had encountered in a living room before. Dense and alive, moving through harmonic territories that most pop musicians of the era never visited. Jazz, but more than jazz. Something constructed from the inside out, built from a logic that didn't care what decade it was living in. The person playing was 16 years old. Jimi set his guitar case down quietly and listened. He didn't say hello. He didn't introduce himself. He just stood near the door and let the music wash over him, and something in his chest, some finely tuned instrument that existed below the level of thought, told him he was in the presence of something genuinely rare. The teenager at the piano was Stevie Wonder. He had already released more than half a dozen albums by then. He had already scored a #1 hit at the age of 12. The music industry had constructed a version of him, Little Stevie, the child prodigy, the miracle from Detroit. But the person sitting at that piano wasn't a marketing concept. He was a musician in the purest sense of the word. Someone for whom music wasn't a career or a product, but something closer to a native language. A way of organizing reality that had been available to him since before he could explain what reality was. Blind from shortly after birth, Stevie had developed an inner ear of extraordinary precision. Biographies and accounts from musicians who worked alongside him during this period describe someone who could identify not only pitch, but timbre, texture, and emotional register with an accuracy that seemed to exceed what most sighted musicians achieved after years of formal study. He heard the world differently, not in the sense of compensation, but in the sense of access. The frequencies that most people processed as background noise became, for Stevie, detailed and legible. Music didn't happen around him. Music happened inside him. What Jimi heard that evening was the product of that inner life made audible. And Jimi stood there, still in his coat, still holding the strap of his guitar case, and felt something he rarely felt, the specific humility of recognizing a peer. But the real question, the one that would define everything that followed, wasn't whether these two men were equally gifted. The question was whether their gifts, which had grown from such radically different soil, could find each other at all. That question would take years to answer, and the answer, when it finally came, surprised everyone in the room, including them. To understand what happened between Stevie Wonder and Jimi Hendrix, you have to understand what each of them was carrying into every room they entered. Jimi had grown up in Seattle, in a household defined by instability and movement. The guitar entered his life the way water enters a cracked foundation. Slowly, inevitably, he finding every available space. He taught himself by listening. He played along with records until his fingers knew the shapes before his mind did. By his early 20s, he had worked the Chitlin circuit, backing artists who treated sidemen like furniture. He had played in dozens of cities, slept in dozens of cars. The music industry had shown him, repeatedly and without apology, exactly where it believed a young black guitarist from the Pacific Northwest belonged, behind someone else, invisible, replaceable. What saved him was the guitar itself, not as an instrument of escape, but as an instrument of truth. When everything else was unstable, the guitar was reliable. Jimi played the way other people breathe, not because he chose to, but because stopping wasn't an option he could conceive of. Stevie had arrived at music through a different door, but the house on the other side was the same. Motown had recognized his talent early and built a structure around it. Tutors, musical directors, carefully chosen material, the controlled environment of a hit-making machine. That structure had given Stevie opportunity. It had also, in ways he was only beginning to recognize by the mid-1960s, constructed walls around a territory whose actual size he hadn't yet measured. What Stevie wanted, what he had always wanted, was musical freedom of a specific kind. Not the freedom to play whatever he felt like, but the freedom to follow music wherever it actually led, even into territories that didn't have obvious commercial logic. He was interested in rhythm in the deepest possible sense, not as the thing that made people dance, but as the organizing principle of all musical experience. He was 16 years old and already thinking about music in ways that most professional musicians would spend their entire careers approaching without ever quite arriving. These were the two people who found each other in that Harlem apartment, two prodigies from completely different worlds, two musicians who had each in their own way outgrown every box the industry had tried to put them in. Two artists who were about to discover that the conversation they needed to have had been waiting for them longer than either of them knew. But here is the thing nobody talks about when they tell this story. Neither of them knew, going in, that the other one could hear what they were hearing. The first time they played together, it wasn't a jam session. It wasn't a performance. And it wasn't even technically music in the way that word is usually understood. It was a question. Stevie had finished playing when he became aware that someone new was in the room. He turned toward the door, not seeing, but orienting the way a musician orients toward a sound, and asked, simply, who was there. Jimi told him his name. Stevie nodded slowly, processing. He had heard the name, though the two had never met. Word traveled through the music world in particular ways during that period, not through radio or press, but through musicians talking to musicians, the informal network of professionals who paid attention to each other because their survival depended on knowing who was doing what. "You play guitar," Stevie said. It was not quite a question. "I do," Jimi said. "Play something." People who recount this kind of encounter tend to frame it as a competition, as if what followed was a battle, a clash of titans, a confrontation between forces that could only produce a winner and a loser. That framing misunderstands what actually happens when two serious musicians encounter each other for the first time. The energy in those moments isn't competitive. It's interrogative. Each musician is asking the other a question, and the question is always the same. Do you hear what I hear? Jimi unpacked his guitar. No amplifier was set up, so he played acoustic, stripped of his usual arsenal. No feedback, no sustain, no walls of harmonic texture built through signal chain. Just the instrument itself and his hands and whatever he could make the two of them say together. He played for maybe 2 minutes. Not a song, an idea, a rhythmic figure that kept shifting its internal weight, landing in slightly different places than a listener's body expected, creating a subtle and persistent sense of beautiful wrongness that turned out, on closer examination, to be actually right. When he stopped, the room was quiet. Stevie's hands were resting on the piano keys, not playing, just touching. His head was tilted slightly, the posture of someone listening not to sound but to the space that sound had left behind. "Do that last part again," he said. Jimi did. Stevie's left hand found a note on the piano. Then his right hand found the chord the note was asking for. And then something happened that people who were in that room would spend decades trying to describe accurately. The two of them began to play together. And the music they made didn't sound like either of them. It sounded like somewhere between them. A territory that neither had visited before, because neither had existed before in proximity to the other. This was not a collision. This was a discovery. By 1967, both of them had become famous in ways neither had entirely anticipated or prepared for. Jimi's arrival in London the previous year had produced a kind of cultural ignition that was difficult to explain in retrospect, and even more difficult to explain in the moment. He had walked into a music scene that believed it had already seen everything the electric guitar could do, and within weeks had quietly, comprehensively, and without any apparent effort demonstrated that the available territory was vastly larger than anyone had realized. Our experience landed like a statement of fact rather than an argument. Critics who had spent years developing precise vocabularies for evaluating rock music found themselves reaching for words that didn't exist. Stevie's trajectory during this period was different in form, but similar in direction. Motown was still shaping his public presentation, but Stevie himself was quietly, persistently pushing against the edges of that shape. He was studying music theory in the formal sense, harmony, counterpoint, orchestration, while simultaneously developing rhythmic ideas that had no precedent in the formal tradition he was studying. When the two of them met again, this time in New York, with more time available and a proper studio not far away, the conversation they had begun in that Harlem apartment resumed as if no time had passed at all. According to accounts from musicians who were present during this period, the sessions that Jimi and Stevie shared were not organized events. They were more like ongoing conversations that happened to require instruments. One of them would start playing something. The other would listen, find the shape of what was being said, and respond, not by repeating it, not by complimenting it in the obvious way, but by finding the question that the statement implied and answering that question instead. What it looked like from the outside was two people improvising. What it actually was, for those who understood the language being spoken, it was something closer to collaborative composition in real time, two minds building a structure that neither could have constructed alone, working from a shared blueprint that neither had drawn in advance. One observer, a session drummer who had worked extensively in both the Motown and rock worlds and therefore had a broader comparative frame than most. Put it this way, most musicians, when they play together, are listening to each other. Jimi and Stevie were listening to the same thing. They just happened to be expressing it through different instruments. There was a night, and this is the night that people who were present tend to invoke when this story comes up, when the conversation became something that nobody in the room could easily categorize. It was late, later than most people's reasonable tolerance for staying awake, and the small studio space where they had gathered had taken on the particular atmosphere of rooms that exist outside ordinary time. The clock on the wall had become decorative, the city outside had gone quiet, and the only reality that seemed to have any weight was the music. Stevie had been working on a rhythmic pattern for the better part of an hour. Not a drum pattern exactly, more a rhythmic concept, a way of organizing 8 beats so that the listener's expectation of where the one fell kept shifting without ever quite being defeated. He played it on a keyboard, then on a drum kit that was set up in the corner, trying to find the version of the idea that was most true to itself. Jimi watched. This was something people noted about him consistently during this period, his capacity for sustained and focused attention to what someone else was doing. He was not passive, his mind was visibly working, his fingers occasionally moving against his thigh as if testing possibilities on an invisible fretboard. But he was genuinely present in a way that was unusual among musicians of his fame and ability. When Stevie settled on the pattern, or more precisely when he arrived at the version that felt most alive, he let it run. And Jimi picked up his guitar. What happened next, according to those who were in the room, was not immediately impressive. Jimi didn't play over the pattern. He played under it, not in the sense of playing bass frequencies, but in the sense of playing something that existed beneath the pattern's surface logic, something that made the pattern sound as if it had always been missing exactly what Jimi was now providing. It took about 30 seconds for the room to understand what it was hearing. The rhythmic concept that Stevie had been developing in isolation suddenly revealed dimensions that hadn't been visible before Jimi entered it. What had felt like a disorientation became a texture, a quality of musical time that felt genuinely new, like a color that had existed in the spectrum all along but had never been isolated and named. Stevie heard it immediately. His playing changed, not an adjustment, a response in the way that a genuine musical conversation produces responses rather than adjustments. The idea evolved because two minds were now inside it instead of one. This continued for approximately 40 minutes. Neither of them stopped. Neither of them spoke. The observers in the room grew still in stages. The way people go quiet in places of unexpected significance. Not because silence was required, but because silence had become the natural response to what was happening. One guitarist who was present, himself an accomplished musician with session credits that most performers would have been grateful for, later described the experience as the most genuinely educative musical encounter of his life. Not because he could fully parse what Jimi and Stevie were doing, but because the gap between his understanding and their practice made visible to him for the first time how much more music could contain than he had previously believed. When it ended, and it ended the way it had begun, without announcement, without resolution, simply by arriving at a place where it was finished. There was a long silence. Then Stevie said something. It was quiet enough that not everyone in the room caught it. What he said was, "I didn't know a guitar could do that." And Jimi, who almost never accepted compliments with anything other than deflection, said only, "I didn't know a piano could do that either." Jimi was, by 1967, famous, conspicuously, unavoidably, sometimes oppressively famous. Everywhere he went, the fact of his fame preceded him. In the eyes of strangers, in the behavior of people in rooms he entered, in the particular way that the industry approached him, already holding a version of him assembled from photographs and reviews and cultural appetite. Fame of that kind does something to a person's ability to be genuinely present. It creates a layer of distance between the person and the room, between the musician and the music. He's between the human being and whatever version of himself the world has decided it needs him to be. When Jimi played with Stevie, that layer dissolved. This is not surprising in retrospect. Stevie was not interested in Jimi's fame. He was not capable of being impressed by the visual apparatus of rock stardom. The clothes, the hair, the particular quality of movement that communicated to audiences they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. What Stevie could access was the music itself, and the music itself was what Jimi had always wanted to be judged by. For once, perhaps the first time since his arrival in London, Jimi was in a room where the only currency that mattered was the thing he could actually produce. The effect on his playing was, by all accounts, significant. Musicians who observed these sessions describe a quality of freedom in Jimi's approach that they had not heard in his live performances. A willingness to follow an idea wherever it led without calculating whether the destination would be impressive. A comfort with silence that his performance context rarely allowed. A capacity for genuine listening that the structure of a rock concert made nearly impossible. This is what Stevie gave Jimi. The experience of being heard rather than witnessed. The distinction sounds subtle. In practice, it was transformative. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970. He was 27 years old. Stevie Wonder heard the news in Detroit, where he was recording. According to people who were with him that day, he went quiet in a specific way they recognized as different from ordinary grief. Not more intense, but more interior, as if something had retreated to a place that language couldn't reach. When he spoke about it publicly, he spoke the way musicians speak about other musicians, precisely with a respect that went beyond admiration into something closer to genuine reckoning with a peer. What Stevie said in various interviews over the years was that Jimi had understood something about music that most musicians spend their entire careers circling without ever arriving at. He used different words at different times, but the core of what he was trying to say remained consistent. that Jimi had possessed an ability to locate the emotional truth of a piece of music and express it directly, without the distortions introduced by technique or training or commercial calculation. That his playing was honest in the deepest possible way. Honest not to genre conventions or audience expectations, but to the music itself, to whatever the music actually was when you stripped away everything it was supposed to be. The music just flowed through him, Stevie said once, like it was coming from somewhere deeper than technique. He wasn't expressing himself through music. Music was expressing itself through him. People who understand what Stevie was saying recognize it as the highest thing one musician can say about another. There is no recording of the most significant sessions that Jimi and Stevie shared. This is a fact that musicians who know about them tend to find genuinely painful. The music that Jimi and Stevie made in those rooms belonged to those rooms, and when the rooms were vacated, the music went with them, in leaving only the memories of people who were there and the slightly altered way those people subsequently heard and thought about music. But something did survive. It survived in the work that both musicians produced afterward, not as direct quotation or obvious influence, but as a quality of attention that people who listened closely could sometimes recognize. A way of treating rhythm as a living thing rather than a mechanical foundation. A relationship to musical space that understood silence as sound's equal partner. An approach to improvisation that was simultaneously more intuitive and more structured than either tradition had previously produced. What Stevie gave Jimi, at the most fundamental level, was a mirror, a reflection that didn't distort, that showed him, from outside, what he could hear from inside. For a musician who had spent most of his career being heard as a spectacle, the experience of being heard by someone who had no access to the spectacle was both clarifying and, in the accounts of those who observed him during this period, visibly affecting. What Jimi gave Stevie was something different and complementary. He gave him access to a way of moving through music that Stevie's own training had made harder to reach, not because the training was bad, but because training of any kind creates habits, and habits create grooves, and grooves can make it harder to find the places in music where everything is still open. Two prodigies from completely different worlds, who found in each other the rarest thing musicians can find in another musician. Not admiration, not inspiration, but genuine recognition. It's the experience of being truly heard by someone who understood exactly what you were saying, because they had been saying the same thing themselves, in a different language, for their entire lives. The music is gone. What remains is the fact that it existed, and the slightly changed way that everyone who heard it subsequently understood what music was capable of being. Music doesn't come from thinking, Jimi once said. It comes from listening. Stevie Wonder listened to Jimi Hendrix play, and heard something that changed the way he understood what music could contain. Jimi Hendrix listened to Stevie Wonder and found in that listening a reflection of his own deepest musical instincts, confirmed, clarified, made more fully visible than they had been before. And somewhere in the catalog of both men, the conversation continues. Not as echo or quotation, but as living tissue, the mark that genuine encounter leaves on genuine art, not a signature, but a deepening, a quality of attention that wasn't there before, and that changes everything it touches.